The son's betrayal in a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there existed a family known for their humble yet tight-knit bond. At the center of this family was Elena Morales, a woman whose life revolved around her only child, Daniel. Elena had been a single mother for as long as anyone could remember. She had lost her husband to a tragic accident when Daniel was just a baby, and from that moment on, she devoted herself entirely to raising him. Every ounce of her energy, love, and attention was focused on ensuring that Daniel had a better life than she had ever known. Elena was known in the town for her generosity and warmth. Despite her own financial hardships, she never hesitated to lend a hand to her neighbors, to offer a kind word, or to help anyone in need. She worked long hours as a housekeeper, scrubbing floors and washing dishes, often coming home late into the night. Her hands were calloused, her back often ached, but she never complained. All of her sacrifices were for Daniel, her reason for living. Daniel, on the other hand, grew up to be a charismatic and intelligent young man. From a young age, he had a charm about him that seemed to draw people in. Teachers adored him, girls were smitten by his good looks, and friends flocked to his magnetic personality. However, there was always something just beneath the surface, a shadow of entitlement and resentment that Elena, in her maternal blindness, could never quite see. As Daniel grew older, the distance between mother and son slowly began to widen. Elena had always believed that with time, Daniel would come to appreciate the sacrifices she had made for him. She was convinced that the bond they shared was unbreakable. But Daniel had other plans. He had tasted the sweetness of attention and adoration outside the home, and the small, suffocating life his mother provided no longer satisfied him. He wanted more freedom, more wealth, more of everything he believed the world owed him. It was around this time that Daniel began to fall in with the wrong crowd. The town, though peaceful on the surface, had its share of secrets. There were whispers of underground gambling rings, shady deals, and people who thrived on exploiting the vulnerable. Daniel, with his natural charm and hunger for excitement, found himself drawn to this darker world. He began spending nights away from home, disappearing for days at a time. And when he did return, it was often with bloodshot eyes and the smell of alcohol or something more sinister clinging to his clothes. Elena worried, of course. She pleaded with him to stay away from those people, to focus on his studies, to think about his future. But Daniel's patience with his mother's constant concern was wearing thin. Every time she nagged him about his behavior, every time she asked where he had been, a simmering rage built inside him. He was tired of her meddling, tired of her constant presence in his life. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Daniel stormed out of the house and didn't return for 3 days. Elena was beside herself with worry. She called his friends, searched the streets, and even went to the police, but no one had seen him. When he finally walked through the door, his face was bruised, his knuckles scraped, and his eyes hollow. Elena rushed to him, her heart torn between relief and fear. But Daniel pushed her away, his voice cold and distant. "I'm not a child anymore, Ma. Stop treating me like one," he spat, brushing past her. That night, as Daniel lay in his room, the wheels in his mind began to turn. He knew he couldn't keep living this double life. One foot in the world of his mother's suffocating care, and the other in the dangerous freedom he craved. He needed a way out, a way to break free from her grasp. And as he stared at the ceiling, a plan began to form. That it was an idea born of desperation. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If he could just get rid of her, if she were no longer around, he would be free. And not only free from her constant presence, but free to take control of everything she had worked for. The house, the little savings she had managed to scrape together over the years. It could all be his. He would be the master of his own destiny. But how? How could he make her disappear without drawing suspicion to himself? The answer came to him in the form of the very people he had been running with. One night, while drinking in the back room of a rundown bar, Daniel overheard a conversation between two men. They were talking about a recent robbery, one that had gone wrong, and how they needed someone to take the fall. Daniel's heart raced as he listened to their plan. They needed a scapegoat, someone who would be easy to frame, someone who wouldn't have the resources to fight back. That's when Daniel realized he could use this to his advantage. If he could somehow involve his mother in this scheme, pin the blame on her, it would solve all his problems. He would be free, and she would be out of the way. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began to subtly manipulate his mother. He told her about a new job opportunity he had heard about, a position working for a wealthy family in the next town over. He said that they were looking for someone reliable and trustworthy to manage their estate, and that the pay was far better than anything she could ever hope to make as a housekeeper. Elena was hesitant at first. She had never heard of this family, and the whole thing seemed too good to be true. But Daniel was persuasive, playing on her desire to give him a better life. "Think about it, Ma," he said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. "This could be our chance. You wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. We could finally live comfortably." Elena, exhausted from years of struggling, finally agreed. She trusted her son. Why wouldn't she? He was her everything, the center of her world. The night before the supposed job interview, Daniel gave her detailed instructions. She was to meet the employer at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He told her it was being renovated and that the owner wanted to show her the plans before offering her the position. Elena, though nervous, didn't question him. She packed her bag, kissed him on the forehead, and left the house early the next morning. What Elena didn't know was that the warehouse wasn't being renovated. It was the site of a recent robbery, one that Daniel had helped orchestrate. The police were already closing in on the culprits, and Daniel had planted just enough evidence to make it look like his mother had been involved. As Elena approached the warehouse, she noticed something wasn't right. The building was dark, abandoned, and there was no sign of the man she was supposed to meet. Her heart began to race as she stepped inside, calling out into the empty space. But before she could react, she was surrounded by police officers, guns drawn, their voices barking orders at her. Confused and terrified, Elena tried to explain that she didn't know what was going on, that there must be some mistake. But the evidence was damning. Her fingerprints were found on a bag of stolen goods, and the police had received an anonymous tip, a tip that Daniel had carefully planted, implicating her in the crime that in a matter of hours, Elena's world came crashing down. She was arrested, charged with theft and conspiracy, and taken to the local jail. The town was in shock. How could someone like Elena, a woman who had always been so kind and generous, be involved in something like this? Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon everyone had an opinion. Some believed she had been framed, while others were convinced that she had been living a double life all along. Through it all, Daniel played the part of the heartbroken son. He visited his mother in jail, feigning tears and promising her that he would do everything he could to clear her name. But deep down, he knew that his plan had worked. His mother was out of the way, and he was free. As the trial approached, Daniel's guilt began to gnaw at him, but he pushed it aside. He had come too far to back down now. He told himself that this was for the best, that he deserved the life his mother had never been able to provide for him. He would move on, build a new life, and never look back. But as the days turned into weeks and the trial drew nearer, Daniel couldn't escape the growing sense of unease that followed him wherever he went. The time in prison, the sound of the iron cell, doors slamming shut, echoed through the narrow, dimly lit corridor. It was a sound Elena Morales had never imagined she would hear, least of all directed at her. She stood there, frozen in the middle of the cold concrete floor, trying to process the series of events that had led her to this moment. Just days before, she had been in her modest home, believing in the better future she had always dreamed of for her son, Daniel. Now, she found herself stripped of her freedom, her dignity, and most painfully, her trust in the person she had loved the most in the world. Elena's trial had been brief but brutal. Despite her protests of innocence, the evidence was overwhelmingly damning. The police had found stolen goods linked to a recent robbery in her possession. Her fingerprints were all over them, and the anonymous tip that had led the police to her painted her as a key player in the crime. The town was shocked, and the small courtroom buzzed with gossip and speculation. People she had once called friends now stared at her as though she were a stranger, their eyes filled with judgment. They whispered to one another about how surprising it was, how even the most seemingly upstanding citizens could hide such dark secrets. The day of her sentencing, Elena looked out into the courtroom, scanning the faces for someone, anyone, who believed her. But the only face that mattered was Daniel's. He sat there, expression unreadable, hands folded neatly in his lap. Elena's heart ached as she met his eyes, searching for a sign of the boy she had raised, the boy she had sacrificed everything for. But Daniel's gaze remained cold, distant, as though she were no more than a stranger to him now. He didn't cry, didn't plead for her, didn't stand up and admit the truth. And in that moment, Elena felt something inside her begin to break. When the judge handed down her sentence, 15 years in prison, Elena didn't even flinch. The words seemed to come from somewhere far away, detached from her own reality. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her feet moving on autopilot, as if her body had already accepted its fate while her mind still struggled to comprehend it. Prison was a world completely foreign to Elena. The towering gray walls, the barbed wire, the constant clanging of metal doors opening and closing, the guards barking orders. It was all so different from the life she had known. Elena had spent her life in small, familiar spaces. The cozy kitchen where she had cooked meals for Daniel, the tiny, sunlit garden where she had grown flowers and vegetables, the quiet streets of the town she had lived in her whole life. Now, she was trapped in a place that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Her cell was small and barren, with a narrow bed bolted to the wall and a thin, scratchy blanket. There was no privacy, no comfort. The cold seeped into her bones at night, making sleep nearly impossible. During the day, she was assigned menial tasks, cleaning, laundry, cooking for the other inmates. The routine was monotonous, and the hours dragged on endlessly. Each day felt like an eternity, and the weight of her sentence pressed down on her with a suffocating force. But the worst part of prison wasn't the physical discomfort or the endless monotony. It was the isolation. Elena had always been a people person, someone who found joy in helping others, in connecting with her neighbors, in sharing stories and laughter. But here, she was cut off from the world she had known. Her fellow inmates were mostly hardened women, some with faces etched in anger, others with expressions of hollow resignation. Few spoke to her, and when they did, it was often with suspicion or contempt. To them, she was just another criminal, another liar who had tried to hide behind a facade of innocence that in the early days, Elena still held on to a fragile hope. She believed that Daniel would come to his senses, that he would realize the terrible mistake he had made and find a way to free her. She imagined him walking through the doors of the prison, tears in his eyes, confessing the truth to the authorities. She pictured the relief she would feel as the guards unlocked her cell and told her she was free to go. She would return home, rebuild her life, and things would somehow go back to the way they were before. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, that hope began to wither. Daniel visited her only a handful of times in the beginning, each visit more awkward and strained than the last. He would sit across from her in the cold, sterile visiting room, his eyes avoiding hers, mumbling half-hearted reassurances. But Elena could see the truth. Daniel wasn't coming to save her. He wasn't going to confess. And the realization that her own son, the boy she had loved and cared for more than anyone else in the world, had been the one to betray her, was a pain unlike anything she had ever known in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. Elena replayed the events in her mind, trying to understand where she had gone wrong. She had always believed that love was enough, that if she gave Daniel everything she had, he would grow up to be a good man. But now, as she lay on the cold, hard mattress in her cell, she realized how little she had really known him. The boy she had raised, the boy she had loved so fiercely, had become someone she didn't recognize. That Elena's body began to break down under the stress of her imprisonment. The long hours of physical labor, the poor diet, and the constant emotional strain took their toll. Her once strong hands, which had scrubbed floors and cooked meals with such care, now trembled with weakness. Her back ached constantly, and her legs felt heavy and sluggish. She caught glimpses of herself in the grimy mirrors of the prison bathrooms and barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. Despite the physical decline, Elena tried to maintain a sense of dignity. She carried herself with as much grace as she could muster, refusing to let the harsh conditions of prison strip her of her humanity. She kept to herself, avoiding the petty dramas and conflicts that erupted between the other inmates. She spent her free time reading, immersing herself in books that offered a brief escape from the grim reality of her situation. It was in these moments, lost in the pages of a novel, that Elena could almost forget where she was. But the moments of peace were fleeting, and the reality of prison life always came crashing back. There were fights, brutal, violent altercations between inmates that erupted over the smallest provocations. Elena learned to keep her head down, to avoid eye contact, to move quickly through the common areas without drawing attention to herself. She became adept at blending into the background, becoming invisible in a place where standing out could be dangerous. As the years passed, Elena's isolation deepened. Letters from the outside world became fewer and farther between. Friends who had once promised to stand by her gradually drifted away, their initial shock and sympathy fading into indifference. The world moved on without her, and Elena was left behind, forgotten. But even in the darkest moments, there was a flicker of defiance inside her, a stubborn refusal to let the injustice of her situation break her completely. She thought often of Daniel, not with the same raw pain that had consumed her in the beginning, but with a quiet, simmering anger. She thought about the life she had given up for him, the years she had spent working herself to the bone to provide for him, and the ultimate betrayal that had led her here. And while that anger sometimes threatened to overwhelm her, it also fueled her determination to survive. Elena began to find small ways to regain control over her life, even within the confines of the prison walls. She threw herself into her work, taking pride in the tasks she was given, no matter how menial. She formed tentative bonds with a few of the other women, sharing quiet conversations during meal times or late at night when the rest of the prison was asleep. These small connections, though fragile, reminded her that she was still human, that she still had a life to live. Even in this place, one of the women Elena became close to was Maria, a tough, no-nonsense inmate who had been in and out of prison for most of her life. Maria was rough around the edges, with a sharp tongue and a hardened exterior, but there was a kindness beneath her tough facade that Elena came to appreciate. The two women would sit together in the yard during their limited outdoor time, talking about everything from their favorite books to the lives they had left behind. Maria had been in prison long enough to know how to survive, and she passed on her wisdom to Elena. She taught her how to navigate the complex social dynamics of the prison, how to avoid trouble, and how to hold on to her sense of self in a place that seemed determined to strip it away. "Don't let this place break you," Maria would say, her voice low and firm. "They want you to give up, to lose who you are, but you can't let them win." Elena clung to those words in the hardest moments. She knew she had to hold on to something, whether it was hope, anger, or the memory of the life she had once known, to survive the years that stretched out ahead of her. But as each day passed, the weight of her sentence pressed down on her, and the thought of spending 15 years in this place became almost unbearable. Still, Elena refused to give up. She couldn't. Not yet. There was something inside her, a small but burning ember of resolve, that kept her going. She didn't know what the future held, or she would ever see the outside world again, but she knew one thing for certain: she would survive. And one day, somehow, she would find a way to make things right. The world outside had moved on, but inside Elena's heart, a storm was brewing. She had been betrayed, wrongfully imprisoned, and left to rot in a place designed to crush the soul. But she was still here, and as long as she was still breathing, there was still a chance, however small, that her story wasn't over yet. The return of the Mother Elena Morales stood outside the heavy iron gates of the prison, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The cold bit at her cheeks, and the chill of the wind seeped through her thin coat, but she barely felt it. After years behind bars, the world beyond those gates seemed surreal, like a dream she had long ago forgotten. The sky stretched wide above her, vast and open, a far cry from the narrow slivers of it she had glimpsed through the barred windows of her cell, to freedom that it should have felt like freedom. But as Elena took her first steps away from the prison, it didn't feel like liberation at all. The weight of the years she had spent locked away still clung to her like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. Her body had grown accustomed to the rigid routine of prison life. And now, standing in the real world, she felt disoriented, unsure of her place. 15 years. She had been imprisoned for 15 long, grueling years. Years that had stolen her youth, her health, and her hope. And all because of a lie. A lie spun by the one person she had trusted above all others. Her son, Daniel. Elena had replayed the events of that fateful day in her mind more times than she could count. The moment the police had arrived at the warehouse, the look of disbelief on her face as they handcuffed her, the cold courtroom where she had been sentenced. And most of all, she remembered the way Daniel had sat silently in the gallery, his eyes cast downward, refusing to meet hers as her life crumbled before her. For years, she had clung to the hope that Daniel would come forward, that he would confess the truth and free her from the nightmare he had placed her in. But as the months turned into years, that hope had withered, replaced by a gnawing emptiness and a simmering anger. Daniel had abandoned her, left her to rot in prison while he carried on with his life. And now, she had returned to the world with nothing. No family, no home, no future. But there was one thing she still had, the truth. And she intended to make sure that the world knew it, no matter what it cost her. Elena's return to the small town where she had once lived was met with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and suspicion. News of her release had spread quickly, and by the time she arrived, the whispers had already begun. People peeked out of their windows as she walked through the streets, their eyes following her with a mix of pity and judgment. Some of the faces she recognized, though they had grown older in the years since she had been gone. Others were strangers, new residents who had heard only the rumors and gossip about the infamous woman who had been convicted of theft and conspiracy. The town itself hadn't changed much. The narrow streets, the old stone buildings, the familiar scent of pine trees from the surrounding forest. It was all as she remembered. But it felt foreign to her now, like she was an outsider in a place that had once been her home. She made her way to what had once been her house, a modest little cottage on the edge of town. The sight of it made her heart clench. It had been her sanctuary, the place where she had raised Daniel, the place where they had laughed, cooked, and shared dreams for the future. But now it was no longer hers. The bank had repossessed it years ago after she was unable to make payments from behind bars, and another family lived there now. Elena stood at the edge of the property, staring at the familiar front door, the windows with curtains that were not her own, and felt the sharp sting of loss. Everything she had once worked for, everything she had built was gone, but her purpose remained. Elena had not returned to the town to rebuild her old life. That life was beyond her grasp. No, she had returned for one reason only: to reclaim what was rightfully hers and to confront the son who had betrayed her. Finding Daniel wasn't difficult. In the age of the internet, even in a small town like this one, it was easy to track someone down. Elena had learned during her time in prison that Daniel had inherited a substantial amount of money after her conviction, most of it from the sale of the house and the modest savings she had scraped together over the years. He had used the money to start a small business, something in real estate, though the details were murky. For the first time in years, Elena felt a fire of determination ignite within her. Daniel had taken everything from her, her freedom, her reputation, her home, but she would not let him keep the one thing that still tied them together: the inheritance. She had worked her entire life to build something for him, to ensure that he would never have to struggle the way she had. But now, it was clear that he had used her love and sacrifice for his own selfish gain. Elena's first stop was a lawyer's office. She had no idea how she could afford the legal battle that was surely ahead of her, but she knew one thing: she would fight. She would fight for the truth, for justice, and for the remnants of her dignity. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Teresa Delgado, listened intently as Elena told her story. At first, Teresa had been skeptical. After all, Elena's name was still synonymous with scandal in the town. But as the details of the case unfolded, as Elena recounted the night she was framed, the evidence planted against her, and Daniel's role in it all, Teresa's expression hardened. She agreed to take the case, promising to help Elena get what was rightfully hers. But before they could move forward with any legal action, Elena knew there was one conversation she needed to have. She needed to face Daniel, to look him in the eyes and demand answers. She had spent years imagining this moment, rehearsing what she would say. But now that it was within reach, she felt a knot of uncertainty twist in her stomach. Would he deny everything? Would he try to justify his actions? Or would he, perhaps, show some shred of remorse? Daniel's new life was far removed from the one he had known growing up. Elena had expected to find him living modestly, maybe in a small apartment or a rented house. But as she approached the address she had been given, her breath caught in her throat. The house in front of her was large, far larger than anything she could have imagined her son owning. It was a modern, sleek home, with tall windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. It looked like something out of a magazine, completely at odds with the small, unassuming boy she had raised. The luxury of it all sent a bitter wave of emotion crashing over her. This was what Daniel had bought with her life. This was the reward for his betrayal. Elena stood at the gate, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she considered turning back, walking away from this confrontation that she had dreamed of for so long. But no, she couldn't. She had come too far, endured too much. She couldn't let fear stop her now. With a deep breath, she pressed the buzzer that a few moments later, the front door opened, and there he was, Daniel. He stood in the doorway, dressed in expensive clothes, his hair neatly styled, and for a moment, Elena barely recognized him. He had changed in the years since she had last seen him. He looked older, more polished, but also harder, colder. There was a sharpness to his features now, a calculation in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Daniel's eyes widened as he saw her standing at the gate, and for a fleeting moment, Elena thought she saw a flash of guilt in his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by something else, surprise, and perhaps a flicker of fear. Elena? His voice was unsure, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. "It's me," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Elena's mind raced with everything she wanted to say, every accusation, every question, but she forced herself to remain calm. She wasn't here to scream or to cry. She was here for the truth. "Can I come in?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though weighing his options. Finally, he nodded and stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The house was even more extravagant on the inside, filled with expensive furniture and art that Elena didn't recognize. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers, a far cry from the cozy, worn warmth of the home they had once shared. Elena felt out of place here, like she was intruding on someone else's life. Daniel led her into the living room, where they sat facing each other on opposite sides of a glass coffee table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, and Elena could feel her heart racing in her chest. "I never thought I'd see you again," Daniel said finally, his voice low. Elena looked at him, studying his face, searching for some trace of the boy she had raised. But all she saw was a man she barely recognized. "I'm sure you didn't," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "You never came to see me. Not after the first few months. You never wrote. You never called." Daniel's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, perhaps? But he quickly masked it. "I didn't know what to say," he said, his tone defensive. "What was I supposed to do? You were in prison, Elena. Convicted. Everyone knew what you did." Elena's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "What I did? You know I didn't do any of it, Daniel. You know I was set up." Daniel's gaze shifted, and for the first time, he seemed unable to meet her eyes. He glanced down at his hands, fidgeting with the cuff of his expensive shirt. "Elena, it's been a long time," he said, his voice quieter now. "What's the point of digging all this up again? It's over. You're out now. We can move on." "Move on?" Elena's voice shook with barely contained anger. "You ruined my life, Daniel. You took everything from me. My freedom, my reputation, my home. And you want me to just move on?" Daniel flinched at the intensity of her words, but he didn't argue. Instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice hollow. You don't understand, Elena. You never did. I was drowning. I was in debt. I didn't have any other options. Elena's heart ached at his words, but the anger burning inside her only grew stronger. She had sacrificed everything for him, and this was how he had repaid her? By betraying her, by framing her for a crime she hadn't committed? You had options, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. You had me. You always had me. But instead, you chose to betray me. Daniel's face hardened, and for the first time, Elena saw a flicker of the ruthlessness that had allowed him to do what he had done. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. Maybe I did, he said coldly. But it's too late to change anything now. Elena stared at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had come here seeking answers, seeking closure, but all she had found was the cold, unfeeling truth. Daniel was not the boy she had raised. He was a man who had made his choices, and those choices had cost her everything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Finally, Elena stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She had gotten what she came for, not the answer she had hoped for, but the truth she had long suspected. I'll see you in court, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't argue. He simply watched as Elena turned and walked out of the house, the door closing behind her with a soft click. As she stepped back into the cold, crisp air, Elena felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the closure she had imagined, but it was something, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that somehow she could rebuild her life, reclaim what had been taken from her, and move forward. But as she walked away from the house that had once been her son's sanctuary, Elena knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. Elena's footsteps echoed against the quiet street as she left Daniel's grand house behind her, each step a reminder of how far they had drifted from one another. The wind howled in the night, pushing against her as if trying to slow her down, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She could feel the bitterness of the cold biting at her skin, but it couldn't compete with the frost that had settled inside her heart. The conversation she had just had with her son weighed heavy on her soul, threatening to pull her down into a despair she had tried to avoid for so long. But that wasn't an option anymore. She had spent too many years in the darkness, too many years imprisoned not only by the walls of the prison, but by the betrayal that had torn her family apart. Now that she was free, truly free, it was time to take back what was rightfully hers. She had made a vow as she stepped out of the gates of that hellish prison. She would find a way to make things right. And if Daniel was going to fight her for it, she was more than prepared. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Elena had known it wouldn't be easy. Daniel had resources, influence, and the advantage of public opinion. To the world, she was still a convicted criminal, and many in their small towns still whispered about her guilt. They remembered the headlines from 15 years ago, the way her story had been plastered across every local paper. Local mother turned mastermind in shocking heist. That was the narrative the public had consumed, and few people cared to question it now. But Elena had an ally. Teresa Delgado, her sharp-eyed lawyer, proved to be a tenacious and brilliant strategist. She believed in Elena's innocence, and more importantly, she believed in justice. Together, they began to gather evidence, piecing together the truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. One of the first things they uncovered was the trail of financial transactions that Daniel had made after Elena's arrest. It didn't take long to find the inconsistencies. Money funneled through shell companies, sudden influxes of wealth that couldn't be explained. It was all there, hidden in plain sight if you knew where to look. And Teresa knew exactly where to look. They dug deeper. They found witnesses who had been too afraid to speak out at the time, people who had known something was wrong but had been silenced by fear or money. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, and the truth that had been obscured for so long finally started to emerge. But the legal system is slow, and Daniel fought back at every turn. His lawyers were aggressive, filing motion after motion to delay the proceedings, to wear Elena down. They painted her as a bitter, vengeful woman seeking to destroy her son out of spite. They tried to discredit her at every opportunity, dragging up her past, highlighting her time in prison as evidence of her untrustworthiness. Yet Elena stood firm. She had been through worse than this, far worse, and she had come out the other side. Every setback only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for the inheritance or for justice. She was fighting for her dignity, for the years that had been stolen from her. As the trial date loomed closer, the tension between Elena and Daniel grew palpable. They avoided each other whenever possible, but the few times they crossed paths in the courtroom or during depositions, the air between them crackled with unresolved anger and betrayal. The son she had once loved so deeply was now her adversary, and the pain of that reality was something she struggled to reconcile with every day. One afternoon, after yet another grueling day in court, Elena found herself standing outside the courthouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She had always loved sunsets, the way they signaled the end of one day and the promise of a new one. But today, even the beauty of the sky couldn't lift the weight from her heart. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Daniel walking toward her, his face a mask of unreadable emotions. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither one speaking. "Elena," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Can we talk?" Elena's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, hoping for, dreading. Part of her wanted to refuse, to turn her back on him and walk away. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the boy she had raised, the boy who had once been her whole world, needed to hear what he had to say. She nodded silently, and they walked together to a nearby park. It was empty, the only sounds the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the distant hum of traffic. They sat on a bench, the distance between them feeling both too far and too close. "I don't know how to begin," Daniel admitted, running a hand through his hair. He looked different now, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself. There was a tension in his posture, a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there when he had first betrayed her. "Try the truth," Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended. She was tired of lies, tired of half-truths and excuses. If Daniel had something to say, it had to be real. It had to be honest. Daniel sighed, looking down at his hands. "I didn't think it would go this far. When I did what I did, I was scared. I wasn't over my head. I owed money to people, dangerous people. And then that deal came along, the one you were working on. It seemed like a way out." Elena's chest tightened. She remembered the deal he was talking about. It had been a business venture, something she had been working on for months, a legitimate opportunity to help their family get ahead. But it had all fallen apart when the police had found the stolen goods in her warehouse, and she had been arrested. "So you framed me," Elena said, her voice trembling with the effort to keep her emotions in check. Daniel nodded, his face pale. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I thought maybe if I took the money, I could fix things, pay off my debts. And then, I don't know, I thought I could make it right somehow. But once the police got involved, it was too late." Elena's heart ached as she listened to him. She had spent so many years wondering why, trying to understand how her own son could do something so terrible. And now, hearing the truth, it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. "You let me go to prison," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "You let me suffer for something I didn't do. For 15 years, Daniel. 15 years of my life gone. How could you?" Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of the boy he had once been, the boy who had looked up to her with trust and love. "I was a coward," he said, his voice breaking. "I was afraid. And once you were convicted, I didn't know how to fix it. I was too ashamed, too scared to face what I had done. So I ran. I ran from the truth, from you, from everything." Elena wiped a tear from her cheek, her emotions a tumultuous storm inside her. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, of hearing Daniel confess, of seeing him acknowledge the pain he had caused. But now that it was happening, it felt hollow. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just an overwhelming sadness for everything they had lost. "I don't know how to make it right," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can." Elena looked at him, her heart heavy with a mix of anger and grief. "You can't," she said softly. "You can't give me back the years I lost, the life I had. But you can stop running. You can stop hiding from the truth." Daniel nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. "I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry." Elena closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had waited so long to hear those words, but they didn't bring the peace she had hoped for. They couldn't erase the years of pain and betrayal. But maybe, just maybe, they were a start. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can try, for both of our sakes." The courtroom was packed on the day of the final hearing. The tension in the air was palpable as Elena and Daniel sat on opposite sides of the room, their lawyers prepared for the final arguments. The media had taken an interest in the case once again, and reporters whispered among themselves, eager for the outcome of the trial. As the judge entered the room, the murmurs died down, and the proceedings began. Teresa Delgado, ever the sharp and focused advocate, delivered a closing argument that left no room for doubt. She laid out the evidence clearly, methodically dismantling the narrative that had been used to convict Elena all those years ago. The trail of corruption, the falsified documents, the witness tampering, it was all laid bare before the court. And then it was Daniel's turn to speak. That he stood slowly, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly as he approached the stand. The room was silent, all eyes on him as he began to speak. "I'm here today to tell the truth," Daniel said, his voice shaky but determined. "The truth that I've been running from for too long. My mother, Elena, is innocent. She always was. I'm the one who committed the crime she was accused of. I'm the one who betrayed her." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but Daniel didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "I let her go to prison because I was a coward, because I was afraid, but I can't run from it anymore. She deserves the truth, and she deserves justice." As Daniel finished speaking, the room fell into stunned silence. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. She had spent so many years waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, she could hardly believe it. The judge nodded solemnly, acknowledging Daniel's confession. The proceedings continued, but in Elena's heart, she knew the truth had finally been revealed. And for the first time in 15 years, she felt the weight of her past begin to lift. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind of media attention and public speculation. Daniel was arrested, charged with the crimes he had confessed to, and Elena's name was finally cleared. The years of injustice had come to an end, and though the scars remained, Elena was free to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy. The years she had lost could never be returned to her, and the betrayal she had endured still haunted her. But Elena was determined to move forward. She had spent too long in the shadows, too long defined by a past that wasn't hers. Now, she had a chance to reclaim her future. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the reporters and cameras that had gathered to capture her moment of victory, Elena felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fight was over, but her journey was just beginning. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something. A strength she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience that had carried her through the darkest of times. And now, as she looked ahead, she knew that no matter what challenges lay in her future, she was ready to face them. The battle had been long and brutal, but Elena had survived. And in the end, that was all that mattered.